But it's not just overt abuse that does the damage. Pupils, without thinking, use words and terms that are homophobic. This Turton High School training session soon turns into a discussion about the word gay.
The fact that it's used to describe even inanimate objects.
Well, how can a chair be gay?
Right.
Are you saying that chair's homosexual, you know? Yeah. And rather than just... Because you do, because you hear it so often, and you know that they're not saying somebody's homosexual or what, you know, they are meaning it's rubbish, they don't want to do it, they're bored, whatever. But you get used to it, don't you, I suppose? And
the problem is it's not just a word, though, is that when you consider it, it's an actual identity.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at maybe another identity word, I don't know, disabled or...
like a racist word or something.
Yeah, racist word.
That would be unacceptable in the
classroom,
you
would stop the class straight away and react to that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I have noticed over the last 2 or so years that the frequency of kids using negative gay terms to describe things, it's not necessarily a swear word, it's something they think they can get away with in the classroom maybe. And when you do highlight to them that is unacceptable, they are quite genuinely surprised because they've been saying it for so long and so frequently, they forget what it actually means.
Bolton Health Promotion leads training like this for newly arrived teachers. They're asked to try for themselves some of the exercises they might use in their tutor groups.
I thought it was very interesting, to be honest. I mean, just seeing some of the lists and things that I guess, I'm aware of but not really thought about in great detail, so I was quite stunned by some of it, yeah.
What sort of things?
For example, just the list of negatives that were being said, and it seemed to be far more on the male side than the female, so that was quite interesting.
I think it was excellent. Puts you in the same situation that you're going to put the children into. I giggled at one point, which was a nervous reaction because I was uncomfortable, and when you get that reaction with the children, I will be able to deal with it better now because they'll be feeling the same as I did.
The next exercise is another that's designed to challenge stereotyping. They take it in turns to choose photographs, cut from magazines, and then make a judgment about the sexuality of the subjects. Are they gay or straight or somewhere in between? For legal reasons, we can't show close-ups of the pictures.
OK, I've got 2 football players, and football's regarded as a macho sport, I guess, from what you see in the news and the papers, so I'm going to go for straight looking.
Okay. I'm not quite sure about that one. There's a black guy with a white vest. Any suggestions?
That's what you think.
What I think, right. I'd probably put it towards the middle.
I find it, I'll be honest, I find it really uncomfortable doing this because I want to say all the time, well, it doesn't matter what you look like. You know? So I think this is a problem with teachers particularly doing this, and some of the more mature, reflective students will have that same issue as well.
Do you think it's a hard exercise, though? Do you think it's okay for kids to be all right to work with young people?
Yeah, I think it's work well
what be
with
really
them, actually.
Because they could have the option not to participate.
I think that point's interesting because we've heard that before, that people might feel uncomfortable about making a judgment. I think sometimes it might be useful to actually say at the session, that you shouldn't feel guilty about this, and maybe relate it to the fact that in society we're all brought up with stereotypes.
Was homophobia something you'd ever given much thought to at all?
Not particularly. There are occasions where you do hear children mentioning things that you think are inappropriate, and you do tackle the issue. But I think after this training, it's sort of made you more aware of how children are and the way that they sort of see things.
Would you feel comfortable taking a lesson about homophobia?
Yeah, absolutely. After that training, I think it's vital that staff are given that opportunity to talk through issues and get some expert input before going into a classroom situation. But after that training, yes, definitely.
Not all teachers have been so willing to learn. The trainers have had to deal with homophobia from members of staff during training sessions.
When the staff came in, before coming on the training, they didn't realise that we were there. And a couple of the male members of staff were overtly homophobic, talking about the session that they were about to go into in a very sort of negative and homophobic way. And we didn't challenge it then. And, that is obviously wrong, because if we are going to make any kind of impact and changing the culture of schools, then we need to challenge both staff and students.
We have had occasion where staff have been quite homophobic when we've done that session.
What do they do?
For example, as Andrew described the name game before, when we've done the photographs and they've used the names that are in that name game, just going along saying, oh, pick the picture up, shirt lifter, puff, fudge packer, all that sort of language. We thought, I think, at one time that they were joking, but it actually became evident in the session that they were actually quite homophobic and didn't feel there was a need to do this work in school.
It's all a bit of a laugh, except when you're on the receiving side of homophobia in school.
There was an example of a boy who was suspended from school for a few days for, these are not my words, but for accusing a PE teacher of being gay. I'm sure this teacher wasn't gay. The point was that the reason for the suspension seemed to be that a boy couldn't do anything more terrible than suggest that someone was gay. But no student that I ever battled with was ever suspended for their homophobic abuse of me.
If kids had been racist, they would be internally excluded or suspended. These kids were just told off. I was made to sit in a room with the girl who physically assaulted me while we had a discussion about why she'd done it, but homophobia was never mentioned.
Bolton Health Promotion, with help from the school and funds from the police, has produced a resources pack and video to use in lessons and for training. Stonewall has produced its own material as part of a campaign called Education for All. At the campaign's heart are 10 things schools can do to create an inclusive culture. It reflects much of the approach taken in Bolton: gathering evidence, challenging homophobia throughout school, addressing training needs for all staff, using outside agencies. It points schools towards groups such as Schools Out. They can offer support outside and inside the classroom. It's an offer that so far is only rarely taken up.
We need to get into schools to get the message across, not just in places like Manchester and London and Brighton, but outside in the smaller towns and the provinces, where a lot of schools still tend to think that it's not an issue, or brush it under the carpet, or pretend that it's not an issue because something else is going on that they see is more important.
Here, sixth formers have gone into groups to consider the causes and forms of homophobic bullying. Tony is soon confronted with one of the main difficulties facing everyone attempting to tackle homophobia: an unwillingness to accept that it is a problem.
My mate who's gay, there's never been any problems whatsoever. Everyone's just accepted, even the lads are fine with him and everything. There's never been a problem.
I've never seen it bullying, actually bullying.
Have you not been organising?
But I know at my school there was never anything like that.
Well, I accept there's geographical differences. I mean, being near Manchester, which is probably one of the most gay-friendly places in Britain, would be very different from the education experience of, say, learning in Inverness. And also, of course, a lot of people at school, they don't actually know their sexuality. They haven't come to terms with their sexuality, maybe, but also they might not have actually realised what it is not yet. They might, still be thinking about it. And they're people who are going to be influenced by things like homophobic bullying as well. And that's another thing that we need to think about. OK?
I don't know, it's just shallow, innit? No, I just don't agree that there is a lot of bullying against gays in schools. I don't think there is. I don't know. It might just be from my school, because my school that I went to has a very strict, non-bullying. They don't agree with it at all. They won't allow anything, and they're really strict on it, and that might be why there wasn't any in our school, but...
There were a couple of people who said, well, it doesn't impact on me, it doesn't affect me. I know somebody who's gay at school, and if anybody gives him any trouble, he gives us good back. But, they're very lucky, and that person is very lucky, and my heart goes out to them. But unfortunately, it is still an issue in most schools, and I had to remind them of that. But it's good that that came out, and it's good that we could challenge it.
Like that man said, if you don't, if it doesn't apply to you and you've never seen it happening, then you can't really relate to it as well as if you've already seen it from somewhere. Obviously, he's had first-hand experience, and he's seen it happening to people, and he's talked to people about it that has happened to them. So, yeah, I agree with his views, but I've never seen it myself, so...
The sixth formers may have been challenging, but all agreed by the end of the session that it did make them think more about their attitudes or those of others.
It made you open your eyes a bit to the fact that the bullying does go on, but because a lot of the time you don't really see it unless you're involved in it yourself. You don't really know what goes on. It's not really a public thing, is it?
It made me think about how
people that got bullied about it actually felt. I'd never thought about that before, so it did change my views quite a bit.
Tackling homophobia has become part of the teacher training course here at Bishop Grosseteste College in Lincoln. Trainees are taught to deal with issues of sexuality and also to confront any lingering fears over Section 28.
It makes them nervous, it makes them want to be looking over their shoulders on this particular issue. And sex and relationships education in general is a sensitive issue, but this one is even more sensitive than that.
The college is organising a national conference next spring called Beyond the Shadow of Section 28. The belief is that homophobia must be tackled with the same urgency and the same resolve as racism.
We have come a long way in the last 20 or 30 years in schools about identifying racial prejudice and racial bullying in schools, name-calling and so on, identifying it, putting a ring round it and saying that's not acceptable in schools. Schools need to be safe places for ethnic minorities. And I think we're now in a position of getting deeper consciousness about sexual diversity and saying basically the same thing. Schools need to be safe places for sexual minorities as well as for racial minorities.
The feeling in this group is that teachers who don't deal with the issue of same-sex relationships are failing in their responsibility to primary pupils, although there's no conclusion about when exactly it should be raised.
It also help other children who have got a mum and a dad accept families where there are two mums or two dads and help them be more understanding towards that family.
Yeah, definitely. Early, if you sort of target the situation early on, then later on it's going to be, they're just going to, it's normal, isn't it?
In my opinion, I think if you leave it till secondary school, it's too late. The prejudices are there. But obviously, too young, the children can't understand basically. So I think it needs to be thought about.
Have you thought about it?
It's quite, I don't know, it's difficult. I do think before senior school, so perhaps upper key stage 2, so that's like year 6 children, but ideas need to be introduced earlier.
I think I'd be very wary about teaching it with primary. But I'd be talking about, rather than focusing on the types of relationship, just saying how two people together feel when they're in love and doing it from that point of view.
So at which point do you start talking about single-sex relationships?
I think I'd have to be very careful about the school's policy and how they'd get the feeling from the head teachers, from the management, and see what their views are before I can address it myself.
Maybe in the past we have reacted, we've tried to deal with bullying when it's taken place, when it's far better to try and stop the bullying occurring in the first place, and developing that culture of respect for all people and respect for differences in school is one way of achieving that.
Let me be clear, you think it's important that sexuality is discussed by children at primary school age?
I'm saying that it's important to talk about different ways of being family. I'm certainly not talking about explaining to primary school children different kinds of sexual practice, and I think that's very distinct.
You'd still be talking about single-sex relationships?
I think that inevitably comes into discussion at some point in primary school because we will talk about my family as one example. And surely it's very unfair to say to one child, well, you can draw your family, but we don't want certain people represented. That would be unjust.
The college encourages secondary school trainees to use subject lessons, not just tutor groups, to challenge homophobia.
Let's take English as an example. Shakespeare, probably bisexual. Can a pupil in secondary schools understand Shakespeare's work, and particularly the sonnets, without realising Shakespeare's sexuality?
Campaigners agree that attitudes aren't going to change overnight, but they won't change at all unless there's more education for pupils and teachers. Whether a school uses its own staff, outside agencies, or a mixture of both, the lessons of doing nothing are, of course, only learned by the victims.
I don't think people really have any idea what a large effect it's causing, and if people did, then I think more would be done.
We've got to get through this, you're gay, and that tells me all I need to know about you. And only visibility can do that.